All right, hello everyone. So in this video, I'm going to be introducing Neptune squaring the nodal axis of the moon. This is a configuration that it's one of the main themes of 2020, but it hasn't been getting as much showtime as all the Capricorn, Mars stuff that's been happening. So I want to really speak about what it means when Neptune is in this configuration with the nodes. And to do that, I actually want to devote some time to explaining the phenomena of planets squaring the nodes. Really, what does that say? What does that speak to? And of course, you're going to have planets like the moon squaring the nodes a couple times a month. But then we'll have slower moving bodies like Neptune or Pluto or Uranus. And when they square the node, it's going to be for a long period of time. And when anything squares the nodes, it really does represent a vital and core essential area of development and growth, where that planet is really a pivotal point, an area where there's a lot of learning, a lot of healing, a lot of emerging. And until that is really understood, there is often this sense of crisis and confusion. So when you have a planet squaring the nodes, it really does emphasize this significant period along our journey, whether it's just a couple of days or if it's a whole year, where getting that planet and working through the nodal axis becomes very essential, necessary to our ongoing evolutionary journey. And in this particular case, we have Neptune that's been pretty much since it regressed in, since the nodes regressed into the Sagittarius Gemini axis. They've been within a 10-degree orb or less since May. And right now they're in a 3-degree orb. They're 3 degrees from an exact square. And they're going to be tightening and tightening and tightening until the end of January of 2021. They're actually not going to get into an exact square. So I'm making this video now because we actually are entering this period where the square between Neptune and the nodes are getting real. It's like, you know, they've been flirting with each other and tightening, but now it's like for the next few months, they're going to be within 2 or 3 degrees, tightening and tightening. And whenever you get within 3 degrees of a square, it's almost like you're there. It's a very potent energy. It's very alive, it's very real. And since Neptune is moving really slowly, this is happening. And it's funny because the nodes will oftentimes station at 1 degree and spend like a month there. So it just happens to be that between 18 and 22 degrees, it's taking like 4 months or something for the nodes to move through those degrees. Sometimes it'll do that in 2 months. So they're all moving really slowly right now. And the area that this is happening is basically in Pisces, Gemini, and Sagittarius. Pretty much they're going to square exactly at 19 degrees. And so this whole thing's happening between 18 and 22 for the next several months. So what I want to do is provide a context for why when a planet squares the nodes, it's so significant. It's so important for our own evolutionary development. It becomes a central issue for the collective unfolding and our personal unfolding. Anything you want to share or speak to or ask about before I continue?
I'm hoping you'll also speak to what it's like when you're born with planets squaring the nodes. Yeah.
Great, yeah. So maybe I can give an example of that. Let's start with just tuning into the nature of the nodal polarity. When we look at the nodes, we're looking at how we're emotionally integrating our experiences. And until it's emotionally integrated, nothing is real. On this evolutionary journey, everything has to inform our sense of self. The I, like the free agent called I, it's always wanting to direct itself towards something. It wants to know itself as something. And it's completely mutable, it's completely flexible. It doesn't really have any kind of objective quality on its own. We all have a different sense of I. We all have a different ego structure. And the nodal axis really serves as a way to shape that sense of self. So as we evolve, as we have new experiences, our sense of self grows to accommodate and become more inclusive of more that we didn't otherwise know. And as that happens, we might find I will never, eat cooked food, and then that's a very specific identity construct, and that identity construct creates a realm of experience. I can never open up to someone. I can never trust someone sexually. I will never buy a new car. All these things. And I'm giving examples that are sort of these absolute nevers that we all have in our own way. Because these are all things that identity does. It wants to know itself as a certain. I will never be in a relationship with someone like this, or I will never have this experience, or I will never eat spinach. And so whatever we create as an identity, it's useful in the sense that it provides a template of an experience. The filter of self that says what is and what is not allowed, what is and what is not possible, creates a very particular template for our human experience. And the human experience is the template of our soul growth. So we're shaping the container of our evolutionary journey through our self-concept. And thus, as we evolve and grow into new experiences, our self-concept has to change, has to open up, has to accommodate to a new way of knowing itself. And if we're not willing to budge, if our self-concept isn't willing to shift or move, then we're going to be in resistance to experience. We might have a health crisis, and it might be relevant for us in that moment to start eating cooked food or explore a non-raw diet, or it might be relevant to buy a new car, or your relationship constructs may not actually be true to what's needed right now. So we find in our evolutionary journey that our self-concept is always sort of needing to be weighed against the reality of what's unfolding on the journey. What's unfolding on our journey isn't our choice. The ego isn't making it up. The self-concept isn't making it up. It's an impersonal thing that the soul is evolving. And the program of our own evolution is something we either get on board with or we don't get on board with it. And that's where we need to be able to adopt to new experiences, new ways of knowing ourselves. And it's important to recognize too, I'm saying we need to be able to adopt. We are other than our self-concept. We are other than our self-identity. That's because we are soul. We are the one evolving. We are the one waking up. We play with self-concept as a strategy, so to speak. It's a part of what we do as we are creating these templates for these experiences, but the self-concept has to keep on opening. There has to be a certain level of fluidity. At the same time, we need safety and security. So if we blow ourselves open, and there's no sense of self, then great. We're also not going to be functioning as a human being either. So there's an interesting flow between the necessity of a self-concept as it creates the space for experience. And thus there needs to be some level of stability in that, but not too much stability to the point that we're not able to change and evolve out of it. Now, the nodal polarity, in virtue of being a polarity, meaning Gemini is always opposite Sagittarius, Libra is always opposite Aries, the North Node and the South Node are always opposite to one another. We're looking at a polarity. And so whenever consciousness has decided, I am this, it means it's created a duality for itself, where there's a whole realm of experience as represented by the polarity that it is in resistance to. The nodal axis, while the South Node has a general correlation to where we've come from, the North Node is an ongoing evolutionary direction. It does not mean we need to leave one behind and then become the other. Ultimately, it's about integration and not being bound by the duality, by the flux between these opposites. Now, when you have a planet squaring the nodes, that's essentially what happens. It basically said there's an unresolved issue, a core piece within consciousness that results, and Jeff Green have spoken about this very beautifully, and he's described it as a flip-flopping between the nodes. In the evolutionary astrology world, we call that a skip step. So if you have this in your natal chart, you can call that a skip step. And what that means, you can really interpret this in the sense of, in order for evolution to proceed, everything has to be integrated. If there's something unaddressed, if there's something unresolved, it's going to create a split within our sense of self. And so we're going to be grasping to find ourselves, to find a sense of safety and security in our life experience. But we're not going to find it until this peace within ourselves is seen clearly. And so what happens in the flux between the nodes when you have a planet squaring it is we're going to have this dynamic where it can either happen throughout one's external experience, and there are all these different ways in which the soul will attract and experience the tension here. But in the end, what it points to is, I'm this, right? This, to use the Gemini Sagittarius axis as the general example. Gemini is gathering data, information, experience, logic, rational. And then Sagittarius is intuitive. It's right brain. It's opening to life experience. So what would it look like for there to be confusion between these two polarities? I mean, give the example of you're driving in a car and you say, I'm just going to trust my intuition and, make a right turn when I feel to make a right turn and not use a map and follow the signs. And then you get completely lost. And so what happens? This can create a sense of confusion. And so consciousness will go to this other polarity. Well, I'm going to be very Gemini now. I'm going to make sure I look at the map all the time. I know exactly where I'm going. But then you miss out on the experiences that are actually here for you because you're so in your head. And so that kind of experience is very common, sort of archetypally, when you have a planet square in the nodes. So what I like to do is give an example of this in the birth chart. And again, this can happen with any planet. It can be with the sun, the moon, an asteroid, anything. Let's put Saturn in the 11th house. Okay, so just imagine, we'll just work with houses to be very generic here. So Saturn in the 11th, what's that about? So Saturn is building, structure, integration. It is alignment. And the 11th house is community, it's liberation, it's your own individuality. So there can be a pressure here around, conforming to the group. Do I fit in? Do I belong to what other people are? Am I, a welcome member of the group of society? This could be your church. It can be your political movement. And there can be issues here with being a part of an elitist community or group and, maybe excluding others or having a lot of judgment, Saturn, and rules around who is included, who's not included. Or these are the ways that you have to act in order to be a part of the community, right? Saturn in the 11th house. What's the intention, of course? It's really living one's life, building a sense of authority within oneself according to one's own individuality, not looking on the outside for external approval. I'm not going to look for belonging by being socially accepted by my group of friends or my movement or my people or my community. I have to find that within myself and be myself, not look for acceptance and inclusion on the outside. Now, let's put the nodes squaring that archetypally. That would be in the 2nd and 8th house. So with a node in the 2nd house, you have this dynamic of isolation, internalization, survival, whereas the 8th house corresponds to merging, sexuality, death, insecurity, letting go of possessiveness, letting go of of holding on, experiencing things that take us out of our own security, our threshold. So a crisis that would happen here that would often be represented by, in this case, Saturn squaring the nodal axis, is the soul will actually become very fixed in their values, very fixed in their way of thinking. And this can manifest in one of two ways. 2nd house, I'm just going to suppress and remain internally, isolated so I can survive. I'm afraid that if I am kicked out of the group or if I'm not socially accepted, I won't have what I need. So I'm going to focus on survival, on making sure everything's taken care of, that I have what I need. And that can express as either being a hermit and kind of living outside of the world and not interacting with community, and thus feeling like we're not participating in society, we're not including ourselves in the world. And there can be a lot of paranoia, being the hermit, isolated from everyone else. I don't want to see anyone. People are out to get me. So that second house dynamic can be a lot of isolation and fear, as much as it can be being in community, but being very internal and withdrawn within oneself, not actually being oneself. That's a lot of suppression. And so then the 8th house polarity here, the north node in this case, or it could be the south node, the node in the 8th house would say, you're in community, you're sharing yourself, you're building trust, you're building bonds. Are they going to accept you? Are you going to be rejected? Are they going to kill you and put you on a stake and torture you because you're different? Right? And so there can be these experiences of, okay, I'm, at the community meeting and I shared an alternative form of working together and everyone said, no, you don't belong here. That's not how we're thinking. And that 8th house, rejection, abandonment, betrayal, I was just triggered by a past life memory of being, burned at the stake for being different than everyone else. And that catapults the soul back into that second house, withdrawing, isolating. And this dynamic can go back and forth and back and forth. Now, the key, of course, is to really understand what's the teaching, what's the crux of that seesaw, that Saturn in the 11th house. When you have a planet squaring the nodes, there is a unique relationship that planet has with both nodes. It is separating from one node, and it is applying towards the other node. And what Jeff Green has found, and I find this to be true consistently in my work with charts, is the node that the planet is separating from is the node that you really want to integrate and give your attention towards. And I'll explain what I mean in a moment. And then,
how do you know which node that it's separating from?
Good question. So you actually just look at the transits in time. If you can envision the nodes move backwards, and so the nodes are moving in the opposite direction of all the other planets. So if you go back in time, the node that Saturn was last conjunct would have been the node that's in the 8th house. So if you kind of imagine it, the 8th house node and Saturn are separating. So they're in a first quarter square. And that's sort of where that's sort of the cycle begins, so to speak. That's sort of the initial point. That's a crisis point that needs to be integrated. And when we give our attention to that particular node, it sort of triggers integration with both nodes.
And for that soul, is it like their process of learning to trust community, to speak their voice, to feel valued, to feel heard?
Exactly.
Is the resolution of both the self-isolation and the rejection.
Exactly. So in this case, it's like by focusing on the 8th house node, it means they karmically have to come into an experience where they are being themselves, whole in their own authority, and are facing their fear of death, basically. Right? So it's actually going to bring up all of the fear of, well, what if I lose my friends? What if they don't like me? And so what that does is it actually brings them out. It brings out their energy. It brings out their own authority. And then the people that come. The people that go. What's meant to happen happens, 8th house. And then through that, there's a stabilization that occurs as well. Meaning they can come back to that node in the 2nd house. And there's a sense of, I have confidence in myself. I'm stable. I'm whole. I have what I need, without that being associated with the paranoia and the isolation of, I don't really belong, or I don't fit in anywhere, or people are going to kill me. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Yeah.
And so with Neptune, this planet representing true forgiveness, our ultimate oneness, what would you say is sort of the resolution node right now? It's also moving retrograde at the moment. Does that affect how we experience the square? Or
the retrograde movement of a planet within the context of the phase it's in doesn't affect. So it's still, even if it's retrograde, it's still within the realm of a first quarter square to one node and a last quarter square to the other node. So in this case, you have Neptune in Pisces, and it's squaring the nodal axis in Sagittarius and Gemini. Sagittarius, in this case, is the resolution node. Right? And to be clear, this doesn't mean everything has to be about Sagittarius, but when we work at unraveling the puzzle, there's a certain order. There's a certain flow to where energy moves, essentially. And in giving our attention to that, it kind of creates a trigger effect of integration. And it's important to recognize, too, that it's not really significant what node we're looking at. Like, it can be the south node or the north node. And that's why a lot of times when we work with nodal dynamics, we have to bring a lot of our attention back to the south node. That's very often the case when a planet's squaring the nodes and it's in the first quarter square with the south node. Okay, so let's now, I guess, maybe introduce a little bit. There's so much that we can say and discuss about this Neptune square to the nodes, but we are looking at Neptune in Pisces squaring the Sagittarius south node and Gemini north node. So yeah, the resolution node here would be the Sagittarius south node, but what we really want to get a feel for is, you could have a planet in Virgo squaring the Gemini Sag axis, and you could have a planet in Pisces, and these are two different experiences. Thus, these are two different puzzles to unravel. They're completely different processes. So let's get a feel for this relationship. As per any square dynamic, the planet that we're dealing with is sort of the theme. So this is a Neptunian dynamic, and so like Neptune is everything God, everything love, everything truth. And it's not conceptual, it's not philosophical, you don't have to learn about it, you don't have to figure something out about it. It's just like, it's what is. And like wherever you look for it, wherever we choose to orient ourselves towards the truth, towards God, towards what's inherently true and forgiving about now, about life, about ourselves, that's where we'll find it. And, I'll say this as well, that with Neptune, there can be either this deep sense of everything is wrong, because everything in creation is one. Everything is an extension of one. And thus it's inherent to everything within creation to have this somewhat of a yearning to remember that. And that's Neptune. It's like, you don't have to have any kind of theism. Everything in creation comes from the source. And so there's an inherent yearning to remember that source, and thus this sense of like, I need to find meaning somewhere. I need to find and feel this sense that there must be something inherently forgiving and true and unifying and wonderful about life, about now, about self. And thus Neptune does correspond to where we're going to seek it in all kinds of places. So we can seek meaning, that ultimate sense of meaning that we're all needing, whether or not we know it, in all kinds of things. It can be a relationship, a drug, a teacher. And what happens with Neptune is whatever provides a sense of meaning and fulfillment and closeness and unity, it's gonna come and it's gonna go. It's like, it can just be an illusion. This relationship makes me feel like $1 million, and it's a perfect relationship, and I feel euphoric, and it's like, great, but like one of you will die first. Like, it's not gonna last forever. And so what we learn with Neptune is to not find fulfillment in a condition, to not look for this peace, this unity in something of the world. We learn about unconditional love. We learn about forgiveness. We learn that the deeper possibility of peace and wellness is something that's available to us because of what we are, not because of a condition. And so that's like the essence of Neptune. Thus, there's a lot of like spiritual devotion and surrender and miracles, but then also a lot of confusion, where we think we found the truth, but it's just a thing that we're holding on to for meaning. So that's a little, intro to Neptune. Do you want to share anything or speak?
Yeah, I think of the Neptunian experience as being someone who, let's say is addicted to drugs or alcohol. Goes through a period of time where originally, like, the drug starts to feel really good and, makes one feel alive and more connected. And then progressively, there is a sickness that comes on and starts to take over the life. And then Eventually, friends and family are wondering, like, what's wrong with this person? You know, they don't leave their house anymore. They, you know, can't be found for weeks at a time. And the soul comes to this place of true despair, actually, in the isolation that's been created by this substance, and complete inability to actually end the cycle of addiction. And from that, there's a moment of surrender that happens inside of the despair that is like the call for God that says, I cannot do this anymore. I need a miracle. Help me out. And wakes up the next morning with the addiction, the compulsion to drink or use lifted for no apparent reason. And for a period of time, there's a sensation of being free from that substance. But the square to the nodes is like, but I don't yet know what my identity is outside of this addiction, outside of being an addict, outside of being an alcoholic. I've lived my whole life. Now the moment has come where the miracle has somehow like liberated me from this condition. And there's a separation state between my identity that has been known and how I experience myself to be. And a lot of people in those moments can go through huge discoveries of a completely new self that emerges, and you know, a feeling of being really deeply connected to God, to Source. So I mean, like, that's what I think of when I think of a Neptune square to the nodes.
You know, archetypally, you know, there are many souls that have Neptune square in the nodes. It could be Neptune in any sign, any kind of nodal axis, not necessarily Gemini and Sagittarius. And it's just that, it's like there's this deep calling along the soul journey to reallocate meaning to where meaning actually is. And there can be this experience within the realm of Neptune of this infinite, indefinite period of things feeling just drag and empty and meaningless and depressing, and sort of like an undefinable time of experience of things just feeling like, when will it change? Or you're not really making your own choices. You're not really engaging. You're sort of dissociated. And all of that can change in an instant when the internal orientation, you know, it's like the fish in water. It's like looking for water. When the internal orientation shifts, everything in one's life can change as well. So yeah, like the Neptune in square to the nodes archetypally really does speak to this relationship. And within that, we can have a lot of sub-themes, you know. Oftentimes in astrology, you'll get stuck on the sub-themes, but kind of forget the essence. Like, what's the core of it? You know, so being duped, being taken advantage of, the archetype of disillusionment, the archetype of confusion, the archetype of deception, or being a deceiver, or being deceived. Like, these are all dynamics that can play out for lifetimes, even for many, many years. And they're all basically a part of the process of realizing what's true. They're all a part of the process of attention being drawn away from the world, away from conditions, away from form, away from circumstance and context, to not look outside for its own salvation. So I guess this is a good point to stop this video. We've introduced the general theme of square to the nodes. You know, in your comments, I'm trying to get into the habit of reading the comments and see if there are any questions. Feel free to ask questions and, you know, share any thoughts that arise for you when we're dealing with Neptune. And we'll make our next video and we'll dive more deeply into this particular configuration of Neptune square in the Gemini Sagittarius axis.